Hello all, this is Chelsea Clary from Clemson University, speaking to English 2140. I hope you're all enjoying your distance learning. Today we're going to be discussing a very specific genre in the American lyrical tradition. As we've discussed before, genre is the paper trail for a historical moment. It's the record of what's happening in a specific era in the minds of the writers and artists of a generation. The post-apocalyptic as a genre is something that keeps recurring. It has several key traits which are present to some degree in most post-apocalyptic works. Fundamentally, it's looking at the end of the world, the apocalypse, and what comes after. Some texts pick up immediately with whatever the calamitous event is, while others pick up with the world some years later. In common, they generally have the failure of some technology, or technologies in general. Whatever tech is current, important, the writer is thinking about, or the composer, or the author, or the poet, or the artist, that technology's failure will be a heavy focus of the apocalypse. Generally speaking, post-apocalyptic literature shows us society after a single massive disastrous collapse event. It's not a combination of factors, or if it is, there's one that's a particular focus. Now, a crisis is not always bad. Literature that picks up after a nuclear meltdown and literature that picks up after the second coming of Christ are both post-apocalyptic literature. The author's attitude toward it is one of the things that defines specific entries in the genre, but good apocalypses do happen. It's less common, but they happen. The primary concern of a post-apocalyptic text generally is how characters, or humanity in general, change due to the efforts to survive and to rebuild after this apocalypse, or sometimes during this apocalypse. When you have tight focus on a small group of characters, it's generally still mythic in scale. That is, it gives us a sense that these characters are representing something very fundamental to the way that we view humanity. So, failing technology, disastrous collapse, and a heavy focus on what has changed as a result, specifically in the nature of humanity. So, here's a list of some examples, some of very many. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which is one of the earliest works of literature that we still have record of, is technically a post-apocalyptic work. The Revelation of St. John, which you may know is the last book in the Christian Bible, is also post-apocalyptic literature. What the apocalypse in question is subject for debate. All flood literature, which you may or may not know that most cultures have a tale of a great flood. Noah's Ark is usually the most familiar one to us in America. War of the Worlds, both the book by H.G. Wells and the Orson Welles radio drama based on it. The Hunger Games, one of my favorite texts, is post-apocalyptic. That's an interesting one because it only hints at what the original apocalypse was, but there are a couple of ongoing apocalyptic events that keep happening, so it's deconstructing that a little bit. Fallout franchise, all the Bethesda Studios games, The Walking Dead comics and TV shows, I Am Legend, the Ray Bradbury novel, or wait, no, that's Richard Matheson. Sorry. The novel and the film. WALL-E, the Pixar movie, the Mad Max movies. The list goes on and on. There are a great many. The post-apocalyptic keeps recurring, and each time it's come back, there's been something somewhat defining about that entry in the genre. Most recent, I would argue, is the 2010s focus on survival games, particularly among indie studios. There's a screenshot from one of my favorites in that genre later on in this presentation. Young adult literature had a whole post-apocalyptic thing in the 2000s. The Hunger Games, again, being the example, but there are several other series. The Maze Runner comes to mind. During the Cold War, interestingly, is another time you had the post-apocalyptic. The US had its big post-apocalyptic push, usually looking at nuclear disaster in the 1960s. Britain and Ireland had its push in the 1980s, which, fascinatingly, England talks about economic apocalypse. Scotland and Ireland are talking more about post-colonialism, so that's a fascinating segment of the post-apocalyptic. Apologies for the weird noise. That's my pit bull shaking her ears. Let me play for you a song from the 1980s British post-apocalyptic by Sting. It's called We Work the Black Seam. This song is an interesting example of both an economic apocalypse, the end of jobs for coal miners, which was a massive hit to the working class population of particularly the north of England. And also it looks forward to the possibility of a technical apocalypse, a nuclear meltdown. So there's another recent example. Going further back, the world wars, for reasons that are probably obvious, also prompt a push of post-apocalyptic texts. And that is largely what we are going to focus on today, is American poetry written during World War I and World War II. However, I don't want anyone to get the idea that this is just primarily a 20th and 21st century genre. There was a big surge of post-apocalyptic literature in the 18th century. Some of it was from great thinkers of the Enlightenment contemplating political structures that they saw as potentially leading to the end of the world as they knew it. Sometimes it was conservative religious thinkers. A lot of the apocalyptic readings of holy texts actually date from the 18th century. So, and again, the Epic of Gilgamesh is technically post-apocalyptic. It is a very old genre. But again, we're going to focus primarily on the world wars. First, however, I want to look at a contemporary text so that I can highlight some of the traits of this genre in that poem. That poem is To Live in the Zombie Apocalypse by Burlee Vang, a Hmong American poet in California who has recently published a few books, specifically an anthology looking at other Hmong American poets' work, and also a book of exclusively his own work. To Live in the Zombie Apocalypse by Burlee Vang. The moon will shine for God knows how long, as if it still matters, as if someone is trying to recall a dream. Believe the brain is a cage of light and rage. When it shuts off, something else switches on. There's no better reason than now to lock the doors the windows. Turn off the sprinklers and porch light. Save the books for fire. In darkness, we learn to read. What moves along the horizon, across the periphery of a gun scope? The flicker of shadows, the rustling of trash in the body of cities long emptied. Not a soul lives in this house, and this house, and this house. Go on, stiffen the heart, quicken the blood. To live in a world of flesh and teeth, you must learn to kill what you love, and love what can die. So, we notice that we have a single precipitating event here. He tells us in the title, the zombie apocalypse. This relies on our pop cultural knowledge of what the zombie apocalypse is and looks like. But that is our single calamitous event. We notice the heavy focus on how people respond. And while the focus is very small and domestic, sprinklers, porch lights, what you do with your own bookshelf, the scale is human. The scale is mythic. It's about fundamentally what survival in a place that is hostile to you requires of a human being. And again, notice the technology here. Not as important here as in some post-apocalyptic works, but again, remember that the way we construct things, the ways that we pass information to each other, are technologies. So the locking of doors, the locking of windows, the way the house comes to represent safety in an entirely different way is looking at both the technological and the human development after this zombie apocalypse event has happened. So that's our 21st century poem as an example of what this genre is looking like at this moment. But let's move back to our era of focus for the day and look at poems from the eras of World War I and World War II. This first one is called The Vampire, and it's quite a long poem, so buckle up, but it's by Conrad Aiken. Aiken was a pretty celebrated poet and novelist. He was friends with several of the experimental poets of the American 20th century, like E. Cummings, T.S. Eliot, and across the pond, Ezra Pound. He was heavily focused on the identity and the sort of dreamlike symbolism that comes into building up the self. He also evaded service in World War I by saying that as a poet, he was a member of an essential industry, which is hilarious. So, Conrad Aiken, The Vampire. She rose among us where we lay. She wept. We put our work away. She chilled our laughter, stilled our play, and spread a silence there. And darkness shot across the sky, and once and twice we heard her cry, and saw her lift white hands on high, and toss her troubled hair. What shape was this who came to us, with basilisk eyes so ominous, with mouth so sweet, so poisonous, and tortured hands so pale? We saw her wavering to and fro, through dark and wind we saw her go, yet what her name was did not know, and felt our spirits fail. We tried to turn away, but still, above we heard her sorrow thrill, and those that slept, they dreamed of ill and dreadful things, of skies grown red with rending flames, and shuddering hills that cracked their frames, of twilights foul with wings, and skeletons dancing to a tune, and cries of children stifled soon, and over all a blood-red moon, a dull and nightmare sighs. They woke and sought to go their ways, yet everywhere they met her gaze, her fixed and burning eyes. Who are you now? We cried to her, spirit so strange, so sinister. We felt dead winds above us stir, and in the darkness heard a voice fall, singing, cloying sweet, heavily dropping through that heat, heavy as honeyed pulses beat, slow word by anguished word. And through the night strange music went, with voice and cry so darkly blent, we could not fathom what they meant, save only that they seemed to thin the blood along our veins, foretelling vile, delirious pains, and clouds divulging blood-red rains upon a hill undreamed. And this we heard: Who dies for me, he shall possess me secretly. My terrible beauty he shall see, and slake my body's flame. But who denies me, cursed shall be, and slain, and buried loathsomely, and slimed upon with shame. And darkness fell, and like a sea of stumbling deaths we followed, we, who dared not stay behind. There all night long, beneath a cloud, we rose and fell, we struck and bowed. We were the ploughman and the ploughed. Our eyes were red and blind. And some, they said, had touched her side before she fled us there. And some had taken her to bride, and some lain down for her and died. Who had not touched her hair, ran to and fro and cursed and cried, and sought her everywhere. Her eyes have feasted on the dead, and small and shapely is her head, and dark and small her mouth, they said, and beautiful to kiss. Her mouth is sinister and red, as blood and moonlight is. Then poets forgot their jeweled words, and cut the sky with glittering swords, and innocent souls turned carrion birds, to perch upon the dead. Sweet daisy fields were drenched with death, the air became a charnel breath, pale stones were splashed with red. Green leaves were dappled bright with blood, and fruit trees murdered in the bud. And when at length the dawn came green as twilight from the east, and all that heaving horror ceased, silent was every bird and beast, and that dark voice was gone. No word was there, no song, no bell, no furious tongue that dream to tell, only the dead who rose and fell above the wounded men, and whisperings and wails of pain, blown slowly from the wounded grain, blown slowly from the smoking plain, and silence fallen again. Until at dusk, from God knows where, beneath dark birds that filled the air, like one who did not hear or care, under a blood-red cloud, an aged ploughman came alone, and drove his share through flesh and bone, and turned them under to mold and stone. All night long he ploughed. So, the question we often ask about this one is, who is the vampire? She's presented as this female figure. She's beautiful but deadly. She's alluring, she's tempting, but to know her is to die in this horrible way. It's been suggested that the vampire actually represents the draft, which, considering Conrad Aiken's avoidance thereof, and the fact that he undoubtedly knew a lot of people who would be off to World War II, it's quite likely, I think. There's that line about, let me go back to it. No, apparently I don't get to. Thank you, PowerPoint. There's the line about, who dies for me shall possess me secretly, but who denies me shall be buried loathsomely. The shame that was heaped upon the unpatriotic, with great big scare quotes, people who did not serve in draft countries was sufficient that it scared some people out of their original draft card burning ways. It's been suggested that she is war itself, in which she reminds me a bit of the way that war is presented in Good Omens, the book by Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman. Also, she could be patriotism, or nationalism, perhaps more appropriately. To see her is to want her, to love her is to go to a terrible, pointless, painful death, and yet to deny her is to be ostracized. In this case, the plowman here at the end, who is as one who does not hear or care, becomes our death figure. So death is indifferent, but war, nationalism has drawn people to him, and yet he doesn't really care and it hasn't really made a difference. So it's an incredibly bleak view of what happens when someone has bought into this apocalypse and become a participant in it. Pretty appropriate and prescient, really, for something that was written before the United States had entered World War II. The next poem we're turning to is a shorter one. You may have read it before, because it's given pretty frequently as an accompaniment to other texts. This one is by Robert Frost, who also you probably know. He's also the author of Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening and The Road Not Taken, in addition to several other volumes of poetry that look at rural ways of life and ways of thinking. Frost was kind of a working class poet, a rural poet. He lived both in England and in various places in the United States, but we associate him heavily with New England. He was very well known in his lifetime and read at the inauguration of President John F. Kennedy, who has this wonderful quote about Frost seeing poetry as the means of saving power from itself. What he meant when he said that was that Frost writes poetry that's about a deep understanding of one's obligation to other people, one's obligation to the land, and one's obligation to oneself. It's often pretty abstract, though. And I will be curious if you think that this next poem conforms to that abstractness that Frost is known for. Here's Fire and Ice. Some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to know that for destruction ice is also great and would suffice. So Frost gives us two opposing elements here. They're not terribly detailed notions of apocalypse, but we have those catastrophic events. One fire, one ice. One of the ways that I've seen this poem used is as a companion to Dante's Inferno, Dante Alighieri, which is commonly taught as a high school text. In the Inferno, the narrator makes a descent through hell and observes all of the people who are there. He inserts a lot of people he doesn't really like. But at the heart of the Inferno, of hell, of this fiery wasteland, he finds the devil himself frozen in ice, because that's the punishment he's come up with for traitors. And this poem is used very frequently to talk about that. Again, we have that understanding of everyone knows what a fiery apocalypse would look like. Everyone knows what the world freezing over would look like. But here he attributes those ends to emotions. Fire is passion, is desire, is this burning want. Ice, he represents as hatred. So this is a very polarizing poem. Some people really love it, some people really hate it. The people who hate it, often in a not terribly icy way, often ask if he was just coming off a bad breakup when he wrote this. It's a very simple poem. In contrast particularly to the vampire that we just read, it's very bleak, pared down, devoid of imagery. And perhaps that's another end that he's envisioning, is just a silence. Perhaps that's a hidden apocalypse here. And I don't know the answer to the question about the breakup before anyone comments to ask, so who knows? Our next poem is from the same year. This one is by Sara Teasdale, who was the first woman to win the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry, although I think it was called the Columbia Prize at the time. But anyway, she was popular with both everyday readers and critics, although critics tended to use phrases like songs of unstudied joy, which is a very weak compliment. People sometimes found her too accessible, not obscure enough, so they found it too simple. But she's still very widely read. In fact, there's a Ray Bradbury story that you're more likely to be familiar with than this poem that uses the title, There Will Come Soft Rains, for a very different kind of post-apocalyptic imagery. And Bradbury chose that title with the assumption that people were very likely to know this, to know this poem. So here's There Will Come Soft Rains. There will come soft rains, and the smell of the ground, and swallows circling with their shimmering sound, and frogs in the pools, singing at night, and wild plum trees in tremulous white. Robins will wear their feathery fire, whistling their whims on a low fence wire. And not one will know of the war, not one will care at last when it is done. Not one would mind, neither bird nor tree, if mankind perished utterly, and spring herself, when she woke at dawn, would scarcely know that we were gone. So you can see here why Teasdale was often described as a lyricist as much as a poet. You've got that alliteration on feathery fire, whistling their whims, fence wire, for instance. It's rather elegant double alliteration that then finishes on the end of that couplet. The poem is arranged into separated couplets, which is pretty unusual by 1920. And it takes more than half the poem before there's any reference to whatever crisis has apparently ended humanity. It's a very calm poem. It's very loving toward nature. But it's worth noticing that even in this vision of a world without mankind, Teasdale still characterizes spring with personification, still characterizes the natural turn of the seasons back toward longer days as a woman who sleeps and then wakes and then knows things. So there's the interesting paradox of her envisioning a world without humans, but she still can't envision that world without humans. This one is often surprising to a 21st century audience, because I think for many of us, when we picture the world having ended and nature's response thereto, we imagine the world being poisoned, not the world being cleansed of us. And this is partly because this poem came out before Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which is the book that was responsible for the banning of the pesticide DDT, and really jump-started the environmental movement as we know it. In the time of the COVID-19 coronavirus in early 2020, 100 years later, we're starting to see some of this rhetoric around nature cleansing itself of humans. But remember, this notion of nature having an inherent balance and everything except humans having this ongoing existence that just balances and cleanses and renews itself is actually a fairly recent concept. Older Enlightenment era and before concepts were more nature is red in tooth and claw. Were more everything wants to kill itself and each other and everything sucks, basically. So, yeah. Now, for all that this is a very gentle poem, I actually find this one more upsetting than the more vivid imagery of the end of the world that we've seen from other authors. Because, and, we're getting personal here, that sense of the world could just end and it would be okay. And my human presence is not really relevant, is very much what suicidal depression feels like. That sense of, it, yeah, people will be sad, but ultimately they'll be better off without me. And things will go on, and there will be renewal. And certainly there is renewal out of grief, but I learned that when I start feeling like this poem makes me feel, I should talk to somebody about those feelings. So we're going to move on at this point. And as we move on, we now come to our last poem. You notice, except for that first one, I've had them in chronological order, so we've come to 1938 now. So, around the beginning of World War II. And this poem is called You Walked a Crooked Mile. It's by Naomi Replansky, who is still alive at the time of recording. This is my all-time favorite poem, and I hope you will enjoy it as much as I do. It's playing on a nursery rhyme that, at the time, children would have been more likely to read. Listeners, you are most likely to know it from its use in the horror movie The Conjuring. There was a crooked man. He walked a crooked mile. He found a crooked sixpence upon a crooked stile. It's a parody of that. Replansky was a target of the FBI under McCarthyism, but she has still slowly but consistently published at several key moments in American history, and she's still publishing up to, I think, 2016 was her most recent live reading, so a lengthy poetic career. Let me read it to you. You walked a crooked mile. You smiled a crooked smile. You dropped a wandering tear, all in a crooked year. When there was one kiss against 10 curses, and one loaf against 10 hungry, and one hello against 10 goodbyes, the odds stalked your crooked steps, and you turned no corner without heart tightening. And against 10 cannon, you had one fist, and against 10 winters, you had one fire. So, we're shown all these images of want and need and insufficiency, and yet struggling against it anyway. And for me, a lot of the hopefulness of this poem comes from the fact that it ends on the fire, which, as we just saw from Robert Frost, represents desire and passion. But here it represents heat and healing and protection against the violent cold of this winter. It's not totally clear what the precipitating apocalypse was in this one, but it's been a crooked year, which here in 2020 feels like a very relevant image. Like, I feel like we all hear a crooked year and we're like, oh yeah, I know what that means somehow. But everything's 1 against 10. Everything's too much to deal with. But our second person addressed by this poem, our you, is dealing with it anyway, through the grief of 10 goodbyes, through the violence of 10 cannons. I really like the imagery of 10 cannon. You had one fist. It's not one pistol against 10 cannon, which would still be a workable image. It's the fist. It's a very self-reliant image, and remembering that Naomi Replansky was somewhere between a socialist and a communist during American McCarthyism, the fist is a symbol of a lot of social movements among marginalized people. In communist rhetoric, the single raised fist represents the power of the worker rising up to claim the means of production. A single raised fist is also a symbol of the Black Power movement. So you can read the fist as a cry for justice from someone who doesn't have anything else to fight with but their own hands. So that's an interesting image to me. And yeah, I ran out of words on this poem because it's my all-time favorite for reasons that are a little hard to articulate. So these are the examples of World Wars era American post-apocalyptic poetry that I have for you. There are others, but these are some of the key ones. Things to think about as you remember these, think about them, perhaps read them again. All of them are available for the Googling. Is there any correspondence you notice between the author's identities and the kind of apocalypse that they envision through their poetry? How does it tie to their histories? How does it tie to their selves? How are references to other texts important in post-apocalyptic poetry we've seen today? How do they function? Would it function better with more? Would it function better with fewer? And do you think we're going to see another big revival of the post-apocalyptic genre in the 2020s? And if so, what do you think it'll look like? If a genre is the literary and artistic reflection of what's going on in people's heads in a given era, what's going on in our heads that's going to come back as a new post-apocalyptic poetry for our era nearly 100 years later? So those are some thoughts to leave you with. I hope you've enjoyed this exploration of post-apocalyptic poetry in the American tradition, and have a wonderful day.